Well, thank you, singers, and thank you, King, for that long reading. It introduces us to the Christmas story. No, not that one. Can I have my first slide, please? There we go, Encounters with Jesus. Thank you. Well, I've been promoting it and sharing with you for some time that we're about to begin a series called Encounters with Jesus. I'm looking forward to going through this series with you because I'm very conscious that from the pulpit we often express our beliefs in terms of theology. But encounters that Jesus had with people were very personal encounters. And yes, we can build a theology from those encounters, but first and foremost, they were individuals like you and me who had an encounter with the God of the universe. And how were their lives impacted? In fact, the gospel stories are a collection of personal encounters. And so that's where we want to go in this series. Everyone who met Jesus was somehow impacted by his presence, by his actions, and by his words in their life. Nobody left the presence of Jesus the same person again. Because an encounter with Jesus was a life-changing experience. And so we want to ask ourselves a question: how will our encounter with Jesus go? Perhaps you yourself have had just such a life-changing encounter. And perhaps throughout this series we may have an opportunity for you to share your life-changing encounter that you have had with Jesus. And if you feel confident to do that, come and chat with me sometime. But I've entitled this morning's presentation, Man's Extremity is God's Opportunity. And if the Christmas story is one thing, it is about man's extremity being God's opportunity. And the Christmas story does not begin, surprisingly, with Jesus. It begins with a relative of his, possibly a second or a third cousin. And it's the birth of John that I want to examine this morning. But before we do, I want to introduce you to this couple. This is Mr. Mohinder Singh Gill and his wife, Daljinder Kaur, an Indian couple, obviously. Last year, 2016, after 47 years of marriage and no children, she gave birth to their first child, Arman. Now, let me just tell you how old they were. He was 79. This was 18 months ago. He was 79 and she was 72. So you're doing the maths right now and you're going, how on earth does a 72-year-old woman have a child? Well, I'll put you out of your misery. With a donor egg and a lot of hormone replacement drugs and IVF treatment, they managed to have their first child. And of course, this created in the media a lot of ethical questions about how old is old to have children. How old is too old to have children? And it certainly sent tongues wagging in their own country and around the world. And perhaps they have made it into the Guinness Book of Records as the oldest couple to have a child. I don't know. But the Guinness Book of Records doesn't take into account the biblical record. And there's quite a few examples of old parents in the Bible. I can think of Abraham and Sarah. I can think of Zechariah and Elizabeth. And there are others that I'm sure you would be aware of as well. And so if tongues were wagging last year when this little child was born to this Indian couple, if tongues were wagging then, do you think tongues might have been wagging a little over 2,000 years ago when an ageing childless couple suddenly became pregnant. And without the benefit of modern technology and IVF as well. And so King very graciously shared that story with us this morning of Zechariah and Elizabeth. You see, man's extremity became God's opportunity. Here was a childless couple, and God was about to perform a miracle in their lives. A miracle enough to get everyone's attention. And the record tells us, just so you're under no misconceptions, the record tells us that Elizabeth was barren and they were both very old. Just to emphasise the point that she was past childbearing age, and for them to have a child now could only be nothing short of a miracle. And of course we know that everyone who hears about these things, their attention is grabbed. What kind of child is this going to be? Notice that it is an angel who appears and tells Zechariah this good news. You see, heaven takes the initiative. Man's extremity of being lost in sin, man's extremity of being doomed to a life where there's no future hope, is God's opportunity to do something amazing and miraculous, to give us hope, to rescue us from sin. As one Christian writer would say, it was when almost the earth was at its darkest hour that God stepped in. God took the initiative and God sent his Son to this world. Well, the angel who came was not just any ordinary angel. He introduces himself as Gabriel, one who stands in the presence of God. And he has come to announce a miraculous birth of a child, not one but two. Why Gabriel? What is significant about that? Well, if you go back in Jewish history more than 500 years, the angel Gabriel appeared to the prophet Daniel and foretold the very events that were about to unfold there in Judea in the 1st century AD. It was Gabriel who had the excitement of telling Daniel about the coming of the Messiah. And here he is, more than 500 years later, on Zechariah's doorstep, and he probably can't contain himself with the excitement of what's about to happen. You see, heaven takes the initiative. And Gabriel says to Zechariah that these words of mine, because he says, because you didn't believe, these words you will no longer be able to speak, these words of mine will come true at their proper time. You see, the coming of the Messiah was something that God had promised long ago, and he came right on time. In fact, the Apostle Paul could write in his letter to the Galatian church, when the time had fully come, God sent his Son into the world to redeem those who were lost. In God's timetable, it was time for the Messiah to come. And the greeting that Gabriel gives Zechariah is somewhat unusual, because he says to him, your prayer has been heard. Now, Zechariah, in his priestly duty, had gone into the temple. Inside the temple was an altar of incense. He would take a censer where he had lifted live coals off the altar of offering outside. He would take those in, together with some perfumed powder, aromatic powder, that was specially designed or specially formulated or mixed for the temple service. He would add those coals to the ones that were already on that altar, and then he would sprinkle the powder over the coals. And the whole service was to represent, as the smoke of that incense went up off those hot coals in front of the veiled curtain in the temple, was meant to represent the prayers of God's people ascending to God. And we know from the record that there were worshippers outside waiting for Zechariah to come out from the task that he had performed inside. And Gabriel stands at the right side of the altar. The right side indicated God's favour. And Gabriel says, "Your prayer has been heard." Now, apart from the shock of being confronted by a supernatural being, Zechariah is probably thinking, which prayer? I've just sprinkled some powder on the altar here. There's a lot of prayers going on outside. But the angel says, not your prayers. He says, your prayer. Which prayer? Which prayer, Zechariah is thinking to himself? It's the prayer that he and his wife had probably prayed for many, many years as they were a childless couple. Lord, can we just experience the joy of having a child of our own? And my guess, he's probably well into his 70s by now. He may even be into his 80s. I don't know. I bet he stopped praying this prayer some 20 or 30 years before. Had God forgotten his prayer? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. His prayer had been heard in the courts of heaven. And now Gabriel was coming to him with an answer. You might feel that there are times in your life when your prayers go no higher than the ceiling of the room that you're in at the time. I want you to know that every prayer that you pray is important to God. Every prayer that a child of God utters to his Heavenly Father does not go unrecorded in heaven. It may not be answered when you expect. It may not be answered in the way you expect. But every prayer that you prayed is important to God. And so Zechariah's prayer is remembered. I want to just share with you something that may be of interest to you. Zechariah's name means Yahweh has remembered. How ironic that the angel should appear to him and say, Zechariah, your prayer has been remembered. Because that's what his name means. And the angel goes on to say, your wife, and we're given it in its English translation, Elizabeth. It's actually in Hebrew, Elisheba, means oath of God. God made a promise to Zechariah because his prayer had been remembered. And the promise he made was his wife would have a child. It was an oath of God, Elisheba. And what was the name that the child was given? In our English translation, we have John. The Greek is actually Yohanan. Very much closer to Johan's name. Yohanan was his name. And that name, if you didn't know, Johan, is Yahweh is gracious. Did you know that? Yahweh is gracious. God is about to do something gracious in human history. Well, Zechariah does the obvious thing, doesn't he? What does Zechariah do? He reasons from his own experience, how can this be? Because Zechariah does the maths. Whoops. Zechariah does the maths. I am well past being a father and my wife can no longer have children. How can this be? Man's extremity is God's opportunity. Man's extremity is God's opportunity. And then the story continues. In the 6th month, in other words, Elisheba Elisheba, however you want to pronounce it, Elizabeth, is now 6 months pregnant. With modern technology, we had that two-dimensional scan before. This is a three-dimensional scan of a child in utero. I don't know how many months old. This looks pretty well down the track, this one. But at 6 months, we read that God sent the angel Gabriel to Nazareth. Again, heaven is taking the initiative. God sent his angel to Mary. But we are first introduced to Mary as a young virgin who is pledged to be married to a man named Joseph. And in a fortnight's time, when we do the story of the birth of Christ, I'll tell you a little bit more about Joseph's name and Mary's name, because again, they're given to us in their English equivalents. But God, if you don't believe it, God has a sense of humour. Can you see that in this story? God takes an ageing childless couple who can no longer have children and blesses them with a child. God takes a teenage girl who shouldn't yet be a mother and also blesses her with a girl. From a human perspective, both were impossible. Elizabeth was beyond childbearing. Mary was a virgin. So from a human perspective, we could all say, how can this be? Indeed. How can it be? Because God can do the miraculous. He doesn't operate in the same realm that we are in. God has a sense of humour. If you can't see that in this story, you need to be able to. Mary's response, very different to Zachariah's. Mary says, I am the Lord's servant. May it be to me as you have said. Mary doesn't question what the angel had said. Very different contrast to Zachariah. And so then we read, Mary hurries down to see Elizabeth. Why do you think Mary made that journey? Because I believe Elizabeth was the only person that would really understand the predicament that she found herself in right at that moment. And she stays with Elizabeth for 3 months because she's not yet ready to face her family, to face her betrothed with the news that she is pregnant. And so she rushes down to see the only person that she knows she can confide in and who will believe her story. Mary hurries down to see Elizabeth. And then that amazing scene happens, because this is the first encounter that we read that someone has with Jesus. Jesus may only be about 2 weeks old. Donna shared with the children this morning how fast a child grows. In that first 9 months of your life in your mother's womb is the fastest that you will grow at any time in your life. Jesus is probably about 2 weeks old, probably no bigger than a pinhead. But he's in Mary's womb. And when Mary walks into the room, the sound of her voice alone causes something miraculous, dramatic to happen. John does a flip in his mother's stomach. I asked Donna to share a little bit this morning about what it's like to have a baby inside. And those of you who are here who've had that experience, mothers, will know exactly what she's talking about. She described it as little butterflies that move around inside your stomach. This wasn't a butterfly move. This was a elbow out move. When Jamie was about 6 months old, I felt for the first time bits of his anatomy coming out the side, his elbow, his heel. Yes, his butt. All of those things. And as a father, touching that for the first time was like, oh wow, I'm responsible for this. But it suddenly brings it home to you, the reality that you're about to become a parent for the first time. John does a flip. Why does John do a flip? Why does John do a flip? Because his mother hears Mary's greeting. John can still hear through the very thin wall of his mother's stomach. John can hear outside sounds, outside voices. Why does John do a flip? Help me out here. It's his first encounter with Jesus. Thank you. Thank you, Pat. Because Zechariah was told his son, would be filled with the Holy Spirit even in his mother's womb. So here's a child full of the Holy Spirit. Guess who just walked into the room? Another member of the Godhead. That's what caused John to flip in his mother's stomach. God had come down in human form. Imagine the angels in heaven. 1 minute Jesus is there, the next minute he's gone. Imagine them trying to get their heads around the fact that he's now just 2 little cells in a teenage girl's womb. And quite rightly, the angel could say, you can call him Emmanuel, God with us. Elizabeth declares in a loud voice. Elizabeth responds to this. She doesn't let this moment go unpassed. She doesn't just say, oh Mary, you should come and feel this. She says in a loud voice, blessed are you among women. Why am I so fortunate that the mother of my Lord should come under my roof? She said it loud because there was good news to proclaim. Well, the story closes finally with John's birth, and the writing tablet comes out, and Yohanan gets written down, and the father's tongue is loosed, and all of a sudden he breaks into song. There's 2 songs that we skipped over in that story because it was too much to read. Zechariah breaks into song, and I want you to notice the reaction of everyone around them. We read this. The neighbours were filled with awe. People were talking about these things, and everyone who heard was amazed and wondered, what then is this child going to be? Indeed, what then is this child going to be? What has God done in your life? How has your encounter with Jesus changed your life? Has it affected you so much that your neighbours are in awe of the changes in you? Are people talking about these things that happened in your life? And are people who hear it wondering, what can become of this person? What's going to become of this person? God sent his Son into this world. God sent his Son into this world so that you and I could have an encounter with Jesus. And that encounter can be life-changing. And that's good news. It's something to share with other people. It's something for other people to see in your life. The life-changing encounter that you can have with Jesus. And so, it is the greatest story that has ever been told. Of God becoming a man, coming to live amongst us and to show us what God is really like. Indeed, what is this child going to be? The neighbours could ask. Well, he grew up to be the man who would announce the coming of the Messiah. And I want to close with the words of 1 John chapter 1 and verse 6. Sorry, John chapter 1 and verse 6 to 9. There came a man sent from God. His name was Johanan. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him, through Jesus, all men might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. The true light that gives light to every man was coming into the world. That's what the Christmas message is about. This year, next year, and every year to come. Every year there has been ever since the birth of Christ. The true light has come into this world, and our lives will never be the same from that encounter. I hope you come back in 2 weeks' time, because that's only the birth of John. We haven't even got to the birth of Jesus yet. So I'm looking forward to sharing that with you in 2 weeks' time. We're going to be favoured with a special item this morning. Brother Lyle Sutcliffe is going to share with us a song of what it means to encounter the life-changing experience of Jesus. Thank you, Lyle.